Hi, everyone, and welcome to another edition of Between the Leaves. I'm Crista Cowan, and joining me are Amy Johnson-Crow, and Gillespie Mitchell, Juliana Szucs Smith, and we are so excited because it is National Family History Month here in the United States, and we've decided we wanted to focus this month on immigration and migration stories in our own family history, and so we'll be sharing some things with you throughout the month to help you with that in your own research, but we thought we'd kick it off with a little hangout where we share some of our own family migration stories. So, Amy, let's start with you. What is your family migration story?
Okay, you would start with me. I have probably the world's shortest migration story. Basically, my ancestors left Scotland. They came to the United States, got to Ohio, and stopped.
Oh, okay.
The end. Moving on. I'm really lucky in one regard that so many of my lines, in fact, all of my direct lines, literally once they got to Ohio, they stopped. It makes it very convenient for my research.
Well, they liked it there.
But it also lets me focus on one very specific area and a very short path, through Pennsylvania, through Maryland, through Virginia. Okay, there was one line that came down from Canada. That's kind of fun. But, I don't have anybody that went out, on the Oregon Trail or anything like that. But, it does make for some very convenient research. Anne, what about you?
All right, and I have a family legend in here, so let's see how this goes. Most of my family came through.
But it also lets me focus on one very specific area.
We've got feedback, it seems. All right, so most of my family came through. It would seem Pennsylvania and then moved down to Virginia. They were all either Germans or Scotch-Irish that came through in the early 1700s, except for one line. They all were here before the Revolutionary War.
Wow.
And the one that came right around the Revolutionary War, I have documented because there was a birth that's listed as Atlantic Ocean as birthplace, which is always a fun place to find in your records. So they were all pre-Revolutionary War, but there was huge migrations of Germans and huge migrations of Scotch-Irish around that time due to political turmoil, right? So they were coming over here. And a lot of them came through Pennsylvania, and then they moved down what is called, it's called various things, the Great Wagon Road, the Great Warrior Road, and that goes down from Pennsylvania down through Virginia, sometimes to North Carolina. And you'll see some articles about this. Actually, we're going to put these out on the blog. So that's how they came down, and then they just sort of moved down. And I do have a few South Carolinians, and I don't think that's where they came from, but I've not documented, but they're all pre-Revolutionary War as well. I do have to go do my DAR applications. But here's the family legend, and I really doubt it's true, but it's published in a book, right? So it has to be. Roll your eyes there. Anyway, so what happened supposedly is this guy named Samuel Donald is on a ship from Scotland, and he's coming across the sea to America, but there's this horrible shipwreck. And he and one other guy are the only two survivors, and they're washed up on shore, and they go to the guy he's with, I forget his name, they go to his small town, and Samuel meets a lady named Annie Ford, and this is back in the late 1600s, and marries her. And that part is actually true because we're all descended from Samuel and Annie, and they eventually, give birth to a couple more generations, and those are the people that come over. So there's that very exciting shipwreck migration story from Scotland down to Ireland, because the English, of course, were pushing all the Scottish people out over into. So whether that's true or not, I don't really know, but it's a fun story, so we'll just sort of go with it. But they were all part of that German-Irish or Scotch-Irish migration.
Julie,
I have the opposite. I have no one pre-Revolutionary War. We're all latecomers. I do have some early Irish that came over before the famine, like in around 1820s. But that is probably, those are the earliest immigrants in my family on both sides. I have some Irish family. The Irish they like New York. They stayed there all the way up to my mom was born in Brooklyn. But on my dad's side of the family, it's kind of interesting because I have Polish and Hungarian immigrants that came around the turn of the 20th century. And the Polish immigrant, Jaja, he came over and he actually went back and forth like 4 or 5 times. And Grandma's story that I'll probably never be able to prove is that he was chased out the last time by the Tsar's soldiers because he spit out a picture of the Tsar. The Tsar soldiers aren't talking, so I don't know how I'll ever prove that story. But anyway, so that's one. And then my Hungarian great-grandparents came over and they settled in southeastern Ohio in mining town. And they went back and I found him going back and forth twice. And he was going with people from the mining camp because in 1902 when he came over, there was a mining strike, and so he was going back and forth bringing people from his hometown saying, hey, we've got work here. So it's kind of cool. But anyways, yeah, those are my immigration stories.
So here's mine. Ready? My most recent immigrant ancestor came in the 1860s from Germany to Texas, to the hill country of Texas. I've also got Irish immigrants who came in the 1840s. I have Mormon pioneer immigrants who came in the 1850s. And then there's this giant gap. I have people who came just before the Revolutionary War, some of those Scotch-Irish that Anne talked about. And then there's another big gap, and my mom and dad both have people who came in the 1600s. My dad has a Mayflower ancestor that we've identified, but a lot that came into Massachusetts Bay Colony over a period of time. And then my mom's family all came really early, late 1600s into Virginia. A lot of French Huguenots and people escaping persecution out of Europe. So I'm kind of a mutt, a migration mutt. And then and then they never stayed put. Hardly at all. My Quaker ancestors in New Jersey were probably the ones who stayed put the longest, but very quickly westward migration, and I'm actually on one line a 5th-generation Californian, so we went coast to coast.
Wow, most people, I mean, I live in California, and most people are not native Californians who live there right now. 5 generations, that's pretty good.
Yeah, my parents were both born and raised in California. Their parents both lived there. My dad's father was born there, and his grandfather and great-grandfather both lived there as well. So, yeah.
Sweet.
Well, what about backwards migration? Anybody have any family that went the other way, either west to east or back to Europe at all? It's kind of.
Well, I had my great-grandfather went back and forth like the 5 times, and I think it's not unusual. I think people don't realize that a lot of times people did do that. They went back to the old country before they finally settled here.
Yeah, it's not.
They went back and forth looking for family members to bring them back, right? I mean, that was part of it.
Yeah, in some ways, and I don't know that he actually intended to stay here. A lot of the immigrants, especially when you talk about 20th century, were just coming over here for work, and then they would go back, their families. I've seen that a lot when I've researched Italian families. A lot of times they went back and forth. They were working over here, and then they would go back and visit the family while their whole family was stayed in Italy. And then eventually, sometimes they would come over, sometimes they just stayed there.
Yeah.
Well, and you see that too, even once they get to the United States, you see people when they want to move on to someplace else, say that they're in Ohio and they can see the smoke from their neighbor's chimney, so hey, it's getting too crowded here. So you see a lot of times that they will buy land ahead of when they move. So they're still living in Ohio, but they're going to buy land in Indiana or Illinois, and then they move out there, and if it doesn't work out, then they still have land in Ohio, and they go back.
Right.
So, if it doesn't work out, they still have that safety net because they haven't sold everything back at the old homestead yet.
Kind of hedging their bets.
Pardon?
Hedging their bets, I guess.
Yeah, exactly. That's exactly what they were doing.
And
sometimes it's a matter of chain migration as well, right? So they'll send a son or a son-in-law out to work that land and report back with, you know, with the intention that they need to know whether it's a good experience or not before they move.
Exactly.
That's a good point.
Exactly. And it's always important to point out people rarely immigrated or migrated by themselves.
Exactly.
They tended to do it in family clusters, and don't just look for the same surnames. Make sure you're looking for the wife's maiden name and others in that group as well. So that's
and look
forget.
Look at church congregations as well.
Yeah, I was just going to say that. Yeah, entire congregations sometimes picked up and moved together.
Yeah. Yeah, whether they all moved at the same time, or like Crista was talking about, having a chain migration where one or two families would go and, hey, it's great where we are, won't y'all come join us? And then you see the rest of the congregation, you know, following along later.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So I mentioned earlier a little bit about how some of my ancestors came to the United States or to the colonies specifically because of religious persecution. What other historical events have you seen in your family history research, reasons why your ancestors either immigrated here or migrated cross-country?
One of the ones that I have is my repasses. They're from Switzerland, actually. And this is research that was done by a cousin of mine, Beverly Repass Hope. But he was a pastor, and they were living in a small town in Switzerland. And because the Germans were in charge then, there was a lot of there was just no good way to make money. They couldn't also, you know, follow their religious practices, those kind of things. I mean, it is sort of a religious story. But the Germans, to leave, you had to get permission, you had to pay all these tariffs. Then when you went down the river, you had to pay a bunch more tariffs. So they were just trying to escape, you know, taxation. I mean, this is an old story. So that was one of the things why they ended up over here, and then they start out in Pennsylvania and they moved down. So, and also the Scotch-Irish. I was just reading an interesting article, because this is the kind of thing I read. An interesting article that the Scottish, when they moved to Ireland, they had started a linen trade. So the Scotch-Irish were actually very involved in making linen, and then the English decided they wanted to move that industry to their residents in England, so they started taxing that a lot, and that's when the Scotch-Irish moved over to the United States. So that was another thing that drove them over there.
That's interesting.
I know.
Julie, what about you? You mentioned the potato famine, right?
Yeah, and I think I told this story before, but since it's so relevant to the conversation, I'll retell it. So forgive me if you've heard that before. But the Huggins family is my great-great-grandparents, and they came over. The parents came over before the famine, and they left their children in Ireland. And then the potato famine hit. Well, the kids were presumably staying with family or friends in Ireland, and they came over after the famine. So that was really kind of an interesting story of chain migration and kind of heartfelt. I can't imagine, you know, leaving your children and then this great, you know, tragedy happens, and they're across an ocean from you. And then they crossed the ocean. The oldest boy was 11. And the next one was 9, the next one was 7. That was my great-great-grandmother. So it's, you know, that really pulls at my heartstrings, that story. And that had to be a difficult thing. They were gone when the parents left. The kids were 2, 4, and 6 years old, so they were gone for 5 years without them.
Wow.
So.
Wow.
Amy, any historical events that have impacted your ancestors' migration?
Yeah, my ancestors, the Steeles, they were living in Washington, D.C. in the 1850s, and they're there in 1860. You know, surprisingly, by 1861, they've moved out of Washington, D.C. Can't imagine why.
What that would be.
Yeah, but you think about it. As far as I can tell, James Steele never served in the Civil War, either for the Union or the Confederacy. You know, and living in Washington, D.C., he could have gone either way,
Sure.
Which is something that you really have to look at with location. But you follow them in the city directories, and all of a sudden, 1861, they're gone, and they've moved to Ohio. They settle in southeastern Ohio. They end up in Washington County, and they're living there 1870, 1880. Then sometime in the late 1880s, 1890s, they moved back to Franklin County, Virginia. So they didn't make it all the way back to Washington, D.C., but they did leave Ohio and get back to closer to where they still had family back there. But it was, I feel pretty certain that it was the outbreak of the Civil War that caused them to leave the D.C. area and go into Ohio where it was a little bit safer.
That makes sense.
Yeah, interesting that war causes a lot of migration stories to happen, right? Even as recently as my grandmother, right? My grandmother, my mom's mom, born and raised in Arkansas, several generations of her family in the same little northwest corner of Arkansas. But, you know, World War II started, and she and 3 of her sisters packed up and moved out to Los Angeles to, you know, work for Boeing. And that's where they stayed and raised their families. So we even see recent wars causing migration stories to happen in families as well.
Oh, yeah.
One of my favorite historical events that caused migration in my family, so I have a branch of my family that was living in Kentucky, and some of you may be aware of this, but in 1812 there was this big earthquake in Kentucky. Random experience, and it was random for them as well. Like, nothing they were prepared for, nothing they had context to understand. And so when this earthquake hit, within months, the entire community up and moved because they were afraid of the effect that this was going to have on their crops. I mean, you know, these were not highly educated people, and again, they had no context for what had just happened. It was just an earthquake, but they were convinced it was the end of the world and that they needed to get out of there. So we see this entire community just pick up and move out of Kentucky just after the 1812 earthquake.
And another thing that happens with events like that, and that particular earthquake made a lot of changes for a lot of people, was that a lot of new religions start at that point, right? Because people are looking for answers. So you might notice some change in your family as they, you know, move to a different church and that kind of thing. But that particular event, I think it's the New Madrid earthquake, right?
That's the New Madrid earthquake.
Tons of people picked up and moved and changed their lives. So yeah, that's an important event.
Yeah. So it's always interesting the things you need to look for when you see a migration happen in your family. Don't just think about, you know, religious changes or wars or, you know, I mean, all of those things play into it, but maybe dig into the weather as well, or natural events.
Yeah, and that's local.
A perfect example.
Yeah, or even look locally too, though. Sometimes there were things that happened on a local level that we didn't have learned about in the history books. But when you look at the local county histories and things like that, sometimes you can find economic events, weather events, things like that really made a change in the community.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, last question of the day, ladies. So, have any of you had the opportunity to travel to places where your ancestors came from, either here in the U.S. or overseas? Who wants to go first?
I can go. Actually, well, as I said, my mom's family, Brooklyn, New York City, they just stayed. So when we go back to New York City, we've got a cousin. He's actually my second cousin, but he's kind of been bitten by the family history bug, and he's awesome. He takes us on these little tours of Brooklyn to the different places where the house where the family lived, or the churches where they were married, things like that. So I always look forward to my trips there. And I haven't been to Ireland, but my mom was. And an Irish researcher helped her determine through Griffith's valuation where our Huggins family actually came from. And she visited a cemetery. She visited the church where my ancestors were baptized and where their parents were married. And she actually got a picture of, this is a picture of the house. I'm trying to get it in the right place. There you go. Can you see that?
Yes.
That is supposedly the Huggins house in County Westmeath. They plotted, you know, pretty much where it should have been based on Griffiths, and so it's this abandoned building, but it's really cool to me. It usually has a well back there. So
very cool.
What about you, Anne?
For me, I've not been to any of the places in Europe that they're from. I've stomped Virginia, North Carolina a lot, right? Because I mean, you have to go. I do know now where the churches in Switzerland where Jacob Repass preached. Daniel Repass, who was his son, was actually born and baptized right there. So that is on my list of places to go. It's just finding the time to get there, right? So, but I've not done a lot of that yet.
You've got a pretty cool house picture too somewhere.
I do. Yeah, but that's the one in Virginia. Not quite as exotic as yours.
How about you, Amy?
Well, I'm pretty lucky since I have so many generations here that we're so close, so I can pretty much get in a car in a couple hours and I can be just about where any of my, now let's say back to third great grandparents where they lived. Some of my earliest memories are actually going down into Lawrence County, Ohio, and going to the old family cemetery and the old church where they went, which was really neat. I also have a picture, but it's downstairs. Didn't grab it. It was really sad. A few years ago, we went back, and the church and the cemetery sit back off the road, and you have to go down this sort of gravel path to get to it. And you go down and you make this curve, and all of a sudden it's there in this clearing. Well, we went down, and we hadn't been for probably 5 or 6 years. Drove down the path, got to the clearing in the trees, and the church was gone.
Aww.
And it was, yeah, one of those deals where it burned down in the middle of the night. Yeah. Yeah, I don't think that they ever caught who actually torched the place, but it was pretty sad. But on the other hand, had a great opportunity last year. Went with my dad, and he showed us where his grandparents lived and where he spent a lot of his summers growing up, and that was really, really neat. So, I don't have the trip back to Scotland yet, but I do have my trips to Lawrence County and Ross County, Ohio, and I'm really thankful for those.
Very cool. Well, I make it a habit of traipsing around to where my ancestors were from. What story do I tell? No, I was raised by parents who, they took us back to Arkansas, and we of course lived in Los Angeles, and I've been to many times to the house that my great grandparents built in the 1920s, and so I was just kind of raised with this appreciation of those places. But I have been to Germany, where some of my ancestors are from, and I've been to Scotland. And Amy, you need to go.
I know. Have passport, we'll travel.
I will go with you. No, Scotland is just, I still remember, first time I went to Scotland was 9 or 10 years ago. I stepped off the train platform in Glasgow, and I burst into tears. And at the time, I wasn't really aware of my Scottish ancestry. I had this vague notion that I had Scottish ancestors somewhere, but I stepped off that train platform and felt like I had come home. That was the only explanation for that. And so I came back about a year later with my mom, and we spent a week doing research in the records there and in the church. Drove around to cemeteries, and I mean, it was a delightful, delightful experience. But I do have a fun experience coming up soon. Some of you know I've visited 49 out of the 50 states. And so my mother, for my birthday, is taking me to West Virginia in a couple weeks. And my earliest Cowan ancestor in this country, he came over in about 1780, 1790. That's where he lived and raised his families. That little sliver of West Virginia in between Pennsylvania and Ohio.
Crista, we might be related.
Hey!
There. We need to talk.
So we're going there, and I couldn't be more excited to check off my 50th state, but also to see the church and the cemetery where they're buried, and there's just something, I don't know, you guys get it. There's just something.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. I love stomping the grounds and standing in the cemeteries. I mean, that's a feeling like no other.
Just knowing that they were there in that place at some point in time is just, there's a connection.
Yep.
Yep, absolutely. Well, so thank you, ladies, so much. This is always so much fun. For all of you watching, we hope that you will maybe take the opportunity to learn a little bit more about your ancestors' migration story. And like I mentioned earlier, throughout the month, all 4 of us will be sharing tools and tips and tricks, so keep an eye on the blog and the Facebook page and our webinars, and hopefully you can learn a little bit more about your migration story as well. Thanks so much, guys. Talk to you later.
Have a great day.
Bye, guys.
Bye-bye.
Bye.